The knife slipped. Silas McCade didn't curse, didn't even flinch, just pulled his palm back and watched the bead of blood swell beneath the grit. The leather strap he'd been working on hung useless between his knees, half-stitched, half forgotten. The wind outside kicked dust under the livery doors, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle blew, a sound that had no business haunting a place like Dry Hollow. He hadn't heard that whistle in 6 months. Silas wiped the blood on his worn pant leg, reached for a rag and stood. The train wasn't scheduled. Hell, Dry Hollow hadn't been scheduled for anything in years. Folks didn't arrive here by accident. They passed through, or they passed away. This town wasn't a destination. It was the bottom of the barrel. And yet, the whistle came again, sharp and hollow, like a warning. He stepped out into the heat, squinting toward the tracks. From behind the general store, he spotted Clara Jennings shading her eyes, apron still dusty with flour. A thin line of smoke curled from the train's stack. It was slowing, stopping, right at the edge of the cracked wooden platform. That train never stopped. Silas narrowed his eyes, lips drawing into a line. He reached for his hat and pulled it low. Whatever this was, it wouldn't be good. The train hissed and sighed like it regretted stopping. Steam curled around the iron wheels as the last passenger car opened and a rail-thin boy stepped down. Dust clung to his boots, worn clear through at the soles. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of a leather suitcase far too big for him, and he gripped the hand of a small girl, maybe 5 years old, if that. She had blonde curls tangled with dust, a dress that hung off her shoulders, and eyes that blinked far too little. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared. The station master, who hadn't sold a ticket in 2 weeks, scratched the back of his head. "You lost, kid?" The boy shook his head. "No, sir." "You got people here?" The boy reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope, the edges soft from being touched too many times. He held it with both hands like it might break if he wasn't careful. Across the front, in a woman's careful script, was written, "Mr. Silas McCade, Dry Hollow, Montana." Silas didn't hear the knock at first. He was back in the livery, pretending not to care, running the whetstone across the edge of the blade he'd dulled on purpose. He knew better than to answer doorways too quickly. In his experience, nothing good ever waited on the other side. The knock came again. Quieter this time, hesitant. When he opened the door, he expected a salesman or maybe the sheriff with bad news. What stood there instead was something else entirely. A boy, holding a suitcase. And next to him, a little girl with dust on her cheeks and shadows under her eyes. "You him?" the boy asked. Silas blinked. "Depends." The boy held out the envelope with both hands. "My mama wrote this. Said if anything happened, I should find you." Silas didn't move, didn't reach for it. He stared at the name like it was carved into a gravestone. "She say who she was?" The boy nodded. "Her name was Marianne Harper. My daddy was Everett Harper. She said you knew him, rode with him once, said you saved his life near the ridge." Silas did know him. Brave, honest Everett Harper. The kind of man who bled out trying to save someone he didn't even know. The kind of man Silas could never be. "I remember him," Silas said quietly. The boy nodded. "He was my father." They sat inside while the light faded outside. Silas poured water into tin cups. The girl, Maisie, sipped hers like it was the last good thing in the world. Jesse didn't touch his. He just clutched the envelope. "She said if something happened, you'd keep us safe," the boy said. Silas leaned against the wall, his hand wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. "Where's your mama now?" The boy swallowed. "She died, fever on the way out. Buried her near Dodge." Silas closed his eyes. The air in the room thickened. No one spoke. The girl's breathing was the only sound. "What's your name, son?" Silas asked after a long silence. "Jessie. Jessie Harper." "And your sister?" "Maisie. She don't talk. Not since Mama." Silas nodded, as if that made perfect sense. It didn't. None of it did. "I ain't exactly cut out for raising kids," he muttered. "I'm not asking you to," Jessie said, voice steady. "I just need work, a place to stay. We won't be trouble." "You came all this way with that plan?" "It's the only one I got." That night, Silas cleared out the bunkhouse behind the stables, found an old blanket, laid it near the stove. The girl curled into her brother's chest like she'd done it 100 times. Jessie didn't ask for more. He didn't ask for anything. Silas stood in the doorway, staring at the two small shapes, lit only by the orange flicker of lantern light. He hadn't agreed to this. He hadn't wanted this. But something in the boy's eyes, the same blue as Everett's, had said otherwise. The next morning, Jessie was already up before dawn. No one told him what to do, but he'd swept the stables, hauled water, and patched a broken gate before Silas had even rubbed the sleep from his eyes. Silas watched from the shadows, arms crossed, unreadable. That boy moved like the world depended on it, because maybe, to him, it did. Silas hadn't meant to start watching the boy. But every morning, like clockwork, Jessie Harper was already moving before the roosters crowed, barefoot in the dust, shirt too big for his frame, hauling feed buckets like a hired ranch hand. The boy never asked what needed doing. He just seemed to know, and he did it with a quiet focus that didn't match his age. Silas kept to the shadows those first few days, arms folded across his chest as he leaned against the frame of the barn. He'd watched the way Jessie checked each stall latch twice, how he swept in tidy, even strokes, how he paused once in a while to whisper something soft to the horses. The animals, usually restless around strangers, had taken to the boy like he was one of their own. Maisie followed him everywhere, her tiny steps silent in the dirt. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just trailed behind Jessie like a shadow. Her wide eyes watched everything but rarely blinked, and when Jessie knelt to give her water or tie her boot, she leaned into his touch like it was the only anchor she had left. By the 4th day, Clara Jennings stopped by the stables carrying a basket wrapped in cloth. "Brought some things," she said. "Hand-me-downs from my niece and a few eggs." "Thought the little one might like the quilt." Silas scratched the back of his neck. "I didn't ask for help." "No, you didn't. But this town watches out for its own, whether you like it or not." He glanced at Jessie in the distance, now perched on a fence post with Maisie in his lap. They were watching the chickens, the boy pointing out feathers like he was teaching her colours. "They ain't mine," Silas said. Clara raised an eyebrow. "They're here. That's enough for me." She left the basket on the steps and walked off without waiting for thanks. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the town in gold and rust, Jessie sat on the edge of the porch. Silas was fixing a broken bridle, hands working in muscle memory, while the boy stared out across the land like he could see something just beyond the horizon. "You ever think about leaving?" Jessie asked. Silas didn't look up. "Every day." "Then why don't you?" He set the bridle down and exhaled through his nose. "Because there's nowhere left I haven't already run from." Jessie nodded slowly. "I think I understand that." Silas turned his gaze toward the boy, really looking at him this time. Jessie wasn't just a kid with a suitcase anymore. He was a boy with something heavy in his chest, and he carried it like no one else would. "You gonna keep us around?" Jessie asked, voice quiet. Silas didn't answer right away. He looked toward the bunkhouse where Maisie slept, curled into the same blanket Clara had dropped off. The porch creaked beneath them. Somewhere down the road, a coyote howled. "I guess I already did," Silas said. The next morning, Jessie woke before dawn again. This time, Silas was already waiting by the water trough. "You're early," Jessie said. Silas handed him a rag. "Daisy's bit needs polishing. You up for it?" Jessie nodded and got to work. His movements were efficient, practiced. Not fast, deliberate. "You know you don't have to do all this," Silas said after a while. Jessie didn't look up. "I know." "Then why?" He shrugged. "'Cause if I stop, I'll remember too much." Silas didn't press. He remembered that feeling. Like if you stayed still too long, the memories caught up and swallowed you whole. Later that day, the mail coach rolled through town, wheels kicking up dust like always. But this time, it brought more than letters. A thin man in polished boots and a stiff bowler hat stepped off the back. His clothes were too clean for Dry Hollow, his expression too tight. Silas watched from the feed store porch as the man scanned the street like he owned it. "I'm looking for Mr. Silas McCade," the stranger called. Silas stepped down. "What for?" The man pulled a folded document from his coat. "Private matter, concerning 2 children, Jessie and Maisie Harper." Silas's jaw tightened. "You got a name?" "Fenton, legal courier." "Dodge County." "You just get off that train?" "I did." Silas took another step closer. "Then I suggest you get right back on it." Fenton cleared his throat. "Sir, I don't think you understand." "Oh, I understand just fine," Silas snapped. "You work for Luther Harper." The man hesitated. "Mr. Harper is the children's next of kin. He's filed a custody claim." Silas's stomach churned. He hadn't heard that name in years, but he remembered everything about Luther, his greed, his temper, the way he twisted family into currency. If Luther wanted the kids, it wasn't out of love. "He doesn't want them," Silas growled. "He wants whatever they stand on." "The matter is legal," Fenton said. "I was instructed to retrieve them, peacefully, if possible." Silas stepped in until they were nearly nose to nose. "You tell your boss if he wants those children, he'll have to come himself. And when he does, he'd best bring more than a court order." Fenton blinked. "This isn't over." "No," Silas said. "It's just starting." That night, he couldn't sit still. He paced the porch as Jessie rocked Maisie to sleep in the doorway. The girl's eyelids fluttered but didn't close, not fully. Jessie hummed something too soft to make out. "You know a man named Luther Harper?" Silas finally asked. Jessie paused but didn't look up. "He came around after Pa died. Mama said not to talk to him. She say why. Said he drank too much, wanted Pa's horses. She wouldn't give them. He got mad, said he'd come back." Silas clenched his fists. "Well, he's back, and he sent a lawyer." Jessie kept rocking. "I figured he might." "You worried?" Jessie finally looked up. "Are you?" Silas didn't answer. Didn't need to. The wind that picked up then was soft but cold, sharp, like something shifting in the dirt just beneath your boots, something coming, and not the kind you could outwork or outrun. The next morning broke with a grey sky and a weight that pressed on everything. Even the wind felt different, less like a breeze, more like a warning. Silas didn't say much over breakfast, not that he ever did, but today the silence felt tighter. He poured black coffee into his dented tin mug and stared out across the dry stretch of land as if expecting someone to crawl out of it. Jessie ate quietly beside him, careful not to slurp the broth Clara had brought over the night before. Maisie sat on the porch with a blanket over her shoulders, drawing invisible shapes in the dust with the toe of her boot. "Gonna ride into town today," Silas said without looking over. Jessie paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Something wrong?" "Just need to talk to Clara. Pick up some feed." It was a lie, at least half of it was, but Jessie didn't push. He never did. "You want me to stay with Maisie?" Silas nodded. "You remember where the rifle is?" "In the pantry." Top shelf. Keep it close. Jesse gave a small nod, then turned back to his meal. He didn't look afraid, just focused, like a boy who'd already had to grow up once too often. Silas saddled his horse, the familiar creak of leather and clink of metal grounding him more than he liked to admit. As he rode into Dry Hollow, he kept one hand near his coat, fingers brushing the paper Fenton had handed him. It wasn't just a notice. It was a threat wrapped in polite ink. Clara was sweeping the steps outside her store when he arrived. "You look like someone who hasn't slept in a week," she said. "I haven't." She paused, then set the broom against the doorframe. "Come inside." He followed her in, and the familiar scent of flour, tobacco, and old pine settled around him. Clara moved behind the counter and poured 2 mugs of weak coffee. "He sent a lawyer," Silas said flatly. "Luther?" He nodded. "Name's Fenton. Showed up yesterday with custody papers. Said there's a claim filed out of Dodge." Clara sipped her coffee. "Can he win?" Silas took a breath. "Maybe. Blood ties hold weight, even when the blood's bad." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to fight," he said. "But I need it legal. I need it done right." Clara reached beneath the counter and pulled out a ledger. "There's a circuit judge in Dodge, Whitaker. He's fair. Not soft, but fair. I'll need affidavits. Town folks. Someone to say those kids are better off with me. I'll get you signatures." He looked at her, really looked. "Why are you helping?" Clara set her cup down with a thud. "Because I've seen the way that boy looks at you, and I've seen the way you look when you think no one's watching." "What way is that?" "Like someone who's finally got something to lose." By midday, Silas had letters drafted, papers requested, and a quiet promise from the clerk that she'd get them filed fast as she could. He'd have to go to Dodge eventually. Face the judge. But he needed more than documents. He needed time. When he returned to the homestead, Jesse was sitting on the porch, Maisie asleep in his lap. The boy's eyes were fixed on the horizon, narrowed. There was a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there this morning. "Someone came by?" Silas asked, dismounting. Jesse nodded. "Wagon. Didn't stop, but they slowed down enough to look." Silas scanned the horizon. "You recognize him? Black hat? Heavy set? Could have been him." "Luther." Silas rubbed his face. He'd hoped for more time. The paperwork wasn't finished. The ink wasn't even dry. And yet, trouble was already sniffing around the edges of their land. That night, he sat with Jesse by the fire outside the bunkhouse. The stars were sharp above them, pinpricks against the black. Maisie was inside, finally sleeping deep. "You still got that letter from your mama?" Silas asked. Jesse nodded. He reached into his coat and handed it over. The envelope was worn thin, the edges soft. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed, creased, and written in tidy cursive. Silas read it again. He knew the words by heart by now, but he read them anyway. "To Mr. Silas McCade. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. I don't ask for much, but if you ever loved Everett like a brother, I ask you to watch over his children. Jesse's smart, strong, but he's still a boy. And Maisie, she's tender. She needs more than just food. She needs gentleness. I've named you as their guardian, officially. I'm sorry to ask this of you, but I trust you more than anyone. Marianne Harper." Silas folded it and handed it back. "She named me legal guardian," he said quietly. "You gonna sign it?" "I am." "First thing tomorrow?" Jesse looked at the fire. "I didn't think anyone had come for us so soon." "Neither did I." The flames crackled between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Jesse said, almost too soft to hear, "If he comes back, Luther, And he tries to take us. Silas met the boy's eyes. He won't. You sure? Silas took a breath, slow and deliberate. No, but I'll be here. That's what I can promise. Jessie nodded. It was enough, for now. The next morning broke with a knock, not a gentle one. Silas was already halfway to the door when Jessie came running from the barn, Maisie clutched in his arms. The wagon was back, pulled up in front of the house. Dust still hung in the air from its arrival. A tall, wide-shouldered man stepped down, black hat low over his brow, dark vest stretched tight over a thick gut. "Jessie," the man said, smooth as snake oil. "Ain't you gonna say hello to your uncle?" Jessie stepped back instinctively. "I ain't yours." Luther's face tightened, then forced a smile. "She ain't here now, boy. That makes me next." Silas stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, but not yet raised. "You're trespassing, Luther." "I got papers?" "I got better ones." Luther sneered. "You think a judge in Dodge gives a damn about your good intentions? I'm family." "You're a vulture. I'm what's legal." Silas walked forward, thrust a document into Luther's chest. The man took it, scanned it, and scowled. "Judge hasn't ruled." "But he's seen the petition, seen the witnesses. You want a fight? Do it in court, not on my porch." Luther looked past him, locking eyes with Jessie. "This ain't over, boy." "No," Silas said, "but it's your turn to run now." Luther climbed back onto the wagon, spitting in the dirt before snapping the reins. As the wagon rolled away, Jessie lowered Maisie to the ground and clenched his fists. Silas watched the road long after the dust had settled. "Get some rest," he said. "We've got a hearing to prepare for." The courthouse in Dodge stood like an old soldier, weathered, upright, and unflinching. Silas stared at its stone steps from the bottom, one hand gripping the envelope that held every document Clara and the town had helped gather. He hadn't worn this coat in years, not since a friend's funeral. It still smelled faintly of smoke and saddle oil. Jessie stood beside him, straight-backed, holding Maisie's hand. The girl clutched a tin horse in her other hand, its paint worn off around the edges. She hadn't said a word since they left Dry Hollow that morning, but her grip never loosened from Jessie's fingers. They stepped into the building as the noon bell rang across the square. The echo of it bounced off the marble floors inside. The courtroom was cooler than Silas expected, quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful, just expectant. Luther Harper was already there. He sat with his lawyer, a narrow-faced man in a high-collared suit and polished boots. They both turned when Silas entered. Luther smiled, the kind that held no warmth. "Didn't think you'd actually come," he said. "I don't run anymore," Silas replied. The judge arrived shortly after. He was tall, thin, and had the tired look of a man who'd heard too many lies in too many rooms. Judge Whittaker didn't smile, didn't nod. He just opened the folder before him and looked over the rim of his spectacles. "We're here to discuss the custody claim of Jessie and Maisie Harper," he began, his voice low but steady. "The blood uncle, Mr. Luther Harper, has filed for guardianship. Mr. Silas McCade has filed a counterclaim, citing a written designation from the children's mother." The judge turned to Luther's lawyer. "You may proceed." The lawyer stood, adjusted his vest. "Your Honor, my client is the only living blood relative of these children. Mr. McCade has no familial connection. He is an aging bachelor, without a wife, income documentation, or parenting experience. He did not respond to the guardianship letter until prompted by outside forces. We contend this is a case of emotional manipulation and small-town favoritism." Silas said nothing. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, "we believe Mr. McCade has deliberately obstructed Mr. Harper's legal attempts to contact the children and has even threatened physical violence." Whittaker raised an eyebrow. "Are you pressing criminal charges, Mr. Harper?" Luther shifted uncomfortably. "Not yet, sir. Then we'll focus on the children. He turned to Silas. Mr. McCade, you may respond. Silas stood slowly. He didn't bring notes. He didn't read from paper. He just looked straight ahead, at the judge, at Jessie, at Maisie. I didn't come here to beg, he said, and I didn't come to argue blood. I came because someone had to. He took a breath. When Jessie showed up at my place, he wasn't asking for pity. He wasn't asking for help either. He was asking for a job, said he'd work for food and a roof. That girl, she hadn't spoken in days. Just clung to him like he was all she had left, and I reckon he was. Whitaker watched him closely. I knew their father, Everett Harper, fought beside him. He died saving my life in a place no one remembers but me. His wife wrote me a letter, one I never answered because I didn't think I had it in me to raise anyone, let alone 2 kids. But they showed up anyway, and that choice was made for me. He nodded toward Jessie. That boy's not mine by blood, but I've seen fathers do far less for their own. He's protected her, fed her, given up every piece of boyhood he had left just to keep her safe. And I've done my best to give 'em more than just a roof. I've given 'em a home. Silas paused, letting that word hang in the air. I don't know what kind of man Mr. Harper is now, but I know what he was when I met him, and I know what those kids have looked like every time his name comes up. Fear don't lie, Judge. He sat down, silence trailing after his last word like smoke. The judge leaned back in his chair. Mr. Harper, he said to Luther, do you wish to speak directly? Luther stood, tugging at his vest. They're my brother's kids. That makes them mine. I've got a house, land, a name. They belong with kin. The judge's gaze shifted to Jessie. And what do you think, son? Jessie startled slightly. He hadn't expected to be called on. Silas turned to him, gave a slow nod. The boy stood. He was trembling, but he didn't let go of Maisie's hand. I don't remember much about before, he said. I remember Mama's singing. I remember Pa taking me out on his horse sometimes, but most of it, it's gone. He swallowed hard. When she died, I didn't know what to do, just that we had a letter and a name, so we followed it. He looked at Silas. He didn't ask for us, but he didn't turn us away either. He didn't treat us like burdens. He listened. He stayed. When Mr. Harper's men came, he stood between us and them, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Judge Whitaker leaned forward. And what do you want, Jessie? The boy took a breath, voice firm this time. I want to stay with Mr. McCade. He's my family now. The judge closed the folder and stood. I'll return with a ruling after a recess. They waited in the hallway. Jessie sat with Maisie asleep in his lap. Silas paced, arms crossed tight, eyes darting toward the courtroom door every few minutes. He hadn't felt nerves like this in years, not since a bullet missed him by inches during a skirmish near Bitter Ridge. But this was worse. This wasn't just life or death. This was something softer, scarier. This was about mattering. When Judge Whitaker returned, the courtroom was still. He didn't sit. He stood behind the bench and looked directly at Jessie. Son, he said gently, it's not often a man earns the right to be called father by choice, but today I believe Mr. McCade has. He turned to the clerk. Let the record show that effective immediately, Jessie Harper and Maisie Harper shall be placed under the permanent guardianship of Silas McCade. The gavel came down. Silas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Jessie looked up at him, unsure. Silas placed a hand on his shoulder. Come on, he said. Let's go home. The ride home from Dodge was quiet, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind you earned. Jessie sat beside Silas in the wagon seat, his arms wrapped around Maisie, who was curled beneath a patchwork quilt Clara had sewn for them. The road stretched long beneath the fading sky, and the clatter of wagon wheels blended with the slow rhythm of a world that finally felt like it might stop spinning so fast. Silas held the reins in one hand and the court papers in the other. The document felt heavier than it should have, more than ink and signatures. It was proof. It was promise. It was a line drawn in the dust between then and now. "You tired?" Silas asked, glancing sideways. Jessie didn't answer right away. "A little," he finally said. "We'll be home before full dark." The word hit Jessie different now. Home. For the first time, it didn't feel borrowed. As they crossed the final ridge before Dry Hollow, Silas could see smoke curling from the chimney of the livery. The sun was just low enough to cast gold across the fields. It almost looked like a painting, one of those old kind that promised peace, even if it wasn't true. The next morning, Silas rose before dawn, habit pulling him from sleep before the rooster. He found Jessie already up, sweeping the porch in small, careful strokes. "You don't have to do that," Silas said, tying his boots. "I know," Jessie said, not stopping. Silas stepped out, leaned against the post. "We just got back yesterday." "You sure you want to start again already?" "I like doing things." Maisie shuffled out of the bunkhouse, rubbing her eyes, the quilt still draped around her shoulders like a cape. She wandered over and leaned into Jessie's side without a word. He handed her the broom, and for a second she just stared at it. Then, slowly, she copied his movements. Awkward, but trying. Silas watched them both. "You know," he said after a minute, "it wouldn't kill you to be a kid." Jessie looked up. "How do you do that?" Silas shrugged. "First thing I'd try is not sweeping at sunrise." The boy smirked, just slightly, and handed the broom to Maisie. Later that day, neighbours began showing up. First Clara, then old Sam Duggan from the next farm over, then Mrs. Penwell with a basket of canned peaches. One by one, they came. Congratulations tucked inside every small gift. Clara handed Silas a fresh baked loaf of bread and pointed to the folded linen inside. "Check the corner." He unwrapped it, revealing the edge of a hand-stitched quilt. The letters SJM were sewn in careful navy thread. Silas James McCade. Beside it, in smaller but no less careful stitching, JHMH. Silas looked up. "Did you plan this before the judge even ruled?" Clara smiled. "I had faith." "Reckless move. Better than doing nothing." By afternoon, the porch was cluttered with jars, sacks of flour, and folded clothes. Maisie ran barefoot across the yard for the first time since arriving. Her laugh, light and sudden, shot through Silas like lightning. Jessie stood by the fence watching her. "She doesn't do that much," he said. "Maybe she didn't know it was allowed," Silas replied. Jessie nodded, eyes on his sister. "You think she'll be okay?" Silas didn't answer right away. "I think she's already halfway there." That evening, as the light softened into dusk, Silas pulled out 2 fishing rods and held one out to Jessie. "What's this for?" the boy asked. "You said you didn't know how to be a kid," Silas said. "Well, this is how I used to start." "You serious?" "I ain't joking with tackle." They walked down to the creek behind the barn, Maisie tagging along, arms swinging freely. The water was slow and shallow, shaded by willows that bent low to kiss the surface. They caught nothing, not a bite. But the peace was real. Maisie dipped her toes into the water and squealed when it splashed. Jessie laughed, an honest, belly-deep sound that made Silas glance over in surprise. The boy had a good laugh. He just didn't know it yet. When the sky turned violet and the first stars peeked out, they sat around a fire behind the stables. Beans bubbled in a dented pot, cornbread warming on a flat stone. Maisie curled up in Silas's lap without hesitation, head resting against his chest. Her fingers found the edge of his shirt and gripped it like an anchor. Silas didn't move. He just sat there, letting her weight settle into him like she belonged there. Maybe she did. Jessie watched them both. He didn't speak, just looked down into the firelight and held that silence like it was something sacred. "You ever think," he said after a long while, "that Pa would have wanted this?" Silas looked over. "You mean us?" Jessie nodded. "Me and Maisie. You. This ranch." Silas didn't answer immediately. He stared into the flames, the reflection flickering in his eyes. "I think," he said slowly, "he'd be proud of the boy you are, and grateful you didn't let his name die on a train platform." Jessie swallowed hard, blinked once, then again. "You think I'm strong?" Silas stirred the fire with a stick. "Stronger than I ever was at your age." There was another pause. Then Silas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in soft cloth. He handed it to Jessie. "What is it?" the boy asked. "Open it." Inside was a belt, well made, with strong leather and a silver buckle. But it was the letters stitched on the inside that froze Jessie's hands. J. H. McCade. The boy looked up, confused. "You gave me your name?" Silas nodded. "Didn't figure you'd mind." "I don't." Jessie's voice cracked. I didn't think I'd ever have one again." Silas cleared his throat, looked away. "It's just a name." "No," Jessie whispered. "It's more than that." Maisie stirred in her sleep, nestling deeper against Silas's chest. Jessie leaned back, legs stretched toward the fire, and smiled. Not wide, not flashy, but real. Tomorrow would bring new problems. Luther wasn't the type to let go easily, and the world didn't magically get easier just because a judge dropped a gavel. But tonight they had peace, and that was enough. The heat came early that morning, pressing down before the sun even cleared the ridge. Silas wiped sweat from his brow as he hammered a new hinge onto the barn door. Jessie stood beside him, steadying the frame, his face flushed but focused. The boy didn't complain, he never did, but his shirt clung damp to his back and he squinted hard to keep sawdust from his eyes. "Pass me the nails," Silas said. Jessie handed over the small tin box and leaned against the wall. "Door was fine last week." "It's not fine now," Silas said, tapping the hinge into place. "Everything around here needs fixing, even when it looks like it don't." Jessie didn't answer. He watched Maisie chase a chicken across the yard, her laughter echoing off the fence posts. Her curls bounced behind her like sunlight on water, and for a second Jessie let himself forget everything that had come before. But the feeling didn't last. By late afternoon, a rider came fast up the road, dust trailing behind like smoke from a gun barrel. Silas saw him first, tall in the saddle, vest flapping, hat pulled low. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle slung low but ready, his gut already telling him it wasn't good news. The rider pulled up hard, dismounted, and handed over a letter with the seal of Dodge County pressed in red wax. "From the sheriff," the man said. "Figured you'd want to know." Silas nodded once, took the envelope, and waited until the rider disappeared in the haze before breaking the seal. Jessie came up behind him, eyes scanning Silas's face. "What is it?" Silas didn't answer right away. He read the note twice, then a third time, each word burning deeper. "It's about Luther," he said finally. "Sheriff says he was arrested, caused a scene at a saloon in Dodge, drunk, loud, claimed he was the rightful guardian of 2 stolen children, said he had proof of fraud." Jessie stiffened. "He's coming after us again?" "Maybe, maybe not. Sheriff asked if I wanted to press charges." Jessie watched him carefully. "And are you?" Silas folded the letter and slid it into his coat. No. Why not? Because we already won. Jesse looked down, chewing the inside of his cheek. Feels like he's still coming. Silas nodded slowly. He might be. But that's his burden now, not ours. That night, after Maisie was asleep, Silas climbed the attic stairs for the first time in years. The space smelled like old wood, dried paper, and something less easy to name. Memory, maybe. Regret. He pulled down a small box covered in dust and brought it to the table. Jesse sat across from him, curious but silent. Silas laid the contents out slowly. A faded photograph, a dull silver pocket knife, an old cavalry medal, and a wedding ring that never made it to a ceremony. "My fiancée," Silas said, voice rough. "Her name was Leela. She passed before I came home from the war." Jesse picked up the photograph. It showed a much younger Silas standing between two other men, one clearly Everett Harper, Jesse's father. "She's pretty," Jesse said softly, glancing at the ring. "She was everything," Silas said. "But I came home a different man than the one she fell in love with. By then, it was too late." He pulled a folded scrap of paper from the bottom of the box, yellowed and barely legible. "What's that?" Jesse asked. Silas unfolded it gently. "It's from your father. He wrote it the day he died." The words were shaky, rushed. "To whoever needs to know, I tried to do right. Tell Marianne I didn't run. Tell Jesse to be better than me. E. Harper." Jesse read it twice, fingers tracing the faded lines. "He was brave," the boy said. Silas nodded. "He was, and he believed in doing right, even if it cost everything." Jesse looked up. "Do you think I'm doing right?" "I think he'd be proud," Silas said. "Of both of us." The days that followed were slow but peaceful. Summer pressed in hard, but the mornings were cool enough to get the work done before the worst of it set in. Jesse started building a swing for Maisie in the big elm that leaned just enough to give shade all afternoon. She watched him from the porch, legs swinging, eyes wide with anticipation. Silas found himself thinking more about the future than he had in decades. He imagined teaching Jesse how to break a horse proper. He pictured Maisie running through town in a dress that wasn't patched at the elbows. He even thought about carving a sign for the front gate. Something permanent. Maybe he'd do it. Maybe not. He wasn't sure if he trusted permanence yet. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low, Jesse came up the porch steps, shirt untucked, sawdust on his arms. "Hey, Pa," he said. "Pass me that hammer?" Silas didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just passed the hammer. The word sat between them for a long second. Pa. Then it settled, natural as breath. The next morning, Silas stood in front of the old fence post near the gate. He had a new sign tucked under one arm. The letters were carved deep, darkened with stain. McCade Harper Ranch. He nailed it in place with 3 solid hits, then stepped back to look. The wind shifted just right, and the sign creaked gently as it settled. Jesse came around the side of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He paused when he saw the sign, said nothing, just walked up, ran his fingers across the carved wood, and smiled. He didn't need to speak. Silas stood beside him, arms crossed. "You sure about the name?" Jesse asked after a moment. "Never been more sure of anything," Silas said. They stood there together, watching the sun rise over the dry hills, the porch creak behind them as Maisie stepped into the light with her tin horse in hand. Whatever came next, they'd face it. Not as strays, not as burdens, but as something else entirely. Family. Fall crept into Dry Hollow slowly, barely noticed at first. just a shift in the wind, the smell of the earth, the way the light bent in the late afternoon. The days still burned warm, but the mornings came crisp, edged with a chill that carried memory in its breath. Silas felt it in his bones, in the way his knees ached when he swung down from the saddle, in the way he lingered by the stove a little longer each dawn. Jesse had taken to the routines like he'd been born into them. He rose before sunup, fed the animals, swept the barn, checked the latch on every gate. But something had changed. His movements were still deliberate, but now there was no desperation in them, no frantic edge. He whistled some mornings, quietly, sometimes off-key. Maisie followed him like always, only now she talked, soft, shy things at first, but words all the same, questions about horses, about clouds, about whether the moon followed her on purpose. One afternoon, Silas sat on the porch carving a piece of mesquite into something not yet clear. Jesse came around the corner, arms full of firewood, his cheeks red from the wind. "You planning on carving that into a saddle horn or just whittling your way to nowhere?" Jesse asked, setting the wood down with a soft thump. Silas looked at him. "Got an opinion on everything now, huh?" "Just the things I live with," Jesse grinned. Silas shook his head, but his mouth twitched. "Help me finish before you get too bold." Jesse sat beside him, pulled out his own pocket knife, one Silas had given him 2 weeks back after Jesse lost his in the creek. "What's it supposed to be?" Jesse asked, nodding at the half-formed shape. Silas hesitated. "Maybe a bird, maybe a dog. Sometimes I start carving before I know." "That seems backward." Silas glanced at him. "Most things worth keeping are." Jesse turned the thought over in his head, nodded. "Fair." The wind picked up just then, and the smell of wood smoke from the Jennings place drifted across the field. Maisie came out of the barn with straw in her hair and a wide grin on her face. She ran across the yard, waving a drawing in her hand. "Look!" she called. "It's us!" Jesse took the paper gently and studied it. 3 stick figures stood under a crooked tree, one tall, one middle-sized, and one with wild curls. Above them, in lopsided letters, she'd written, "Our Ranch." Silas looked down at it and cleared his throat. "You hang that up somewhere," he said, almost gruff. "Don't let the wind take it." That night, after dinner, Silas found Jesse sitting out by the fence, legs dangling over the side, looking up at the stars. "You ever wonder what your father would think of all this?" Silas asked, sitting beside him. Jesse nodded. "All the time." "You think he'd approve?" Jesse shrugged. "He died before I really knew him, but I think he'd be happy we didn't give up." Silas leaned back against the post. "He'd be proud of you. I know that for sure." Jesse looked over. "You ever think about, I don't know, starting over?" "I already did," Silas said quietly. "When you two stepped off that train." A few days later, a letter came from Dodge, this one not from the sheriff, but from a government office. Silas read it at the kitchen table, eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Jesse asked. "Land assessment," Silas muttered. "Looks like someone filed a formal complaint. Disputed ownership, said the McCade-Harper boundary isn't properly recorded." Jesse tensed. "Was it Luther?" "Hard to say, but it smells like him." "Can he still come after us?" Silas folded the letter. "Not through court, but if he can't take you, he'll try to take the dirt under your boots." "What do we do?" "We get ahead of it. I'll ride into the assessor's office tomorrow. Bring the deed. Talk to someone face to face." "I'll come," Jesse said. "No," Silas replied. "You stay here. Watch Maisie. Keep her close." Jesse didn't argue, but his jaw set firm. That night, Silas packed a saddlebag with documents, a flask, and a worn photograph of Everett Harper. He stared at it longer than usual before sliding it into the pocket near his heart. Silas rode out before dawn. Jesse watched from the porch, Maisie clutching his hand. The sun hadn't crested yet, and the shadows still stretched long across the dirt. Silas raised a hand once, then disappeared into the horizon. The hours passed slow. Jessie split firewood, fed the animals, taught Maisie how to brush the old mare without getting kicked. He kept the rifle close. Didn't tell Maisie why, just in case. That evening, just before sunset, Silas rode back up the trail, coat dusty, hat pulled low. Jessie met him halfway across the yard. "Well?" the boy asked. Silas dismounted, handed over a stamped form. Boundary confirmed, deed solid, complaint dismissed. Jessie exhaled hard, like a held breath finally released. "You think he'll stop now?" he asked. Silas looked toward the west, where the sun bled red into the clouds. "I think men like Luther don't ever stop, but they fade. If you stand your ground long enough, even the worst storms burn out." Maisie ran up and wrapped herself around Silas's leg, grinning. He reached down, ruffled her curls. "You miss me?" She nodded, eyes wide. "Missed your snoring," Jessie added with a smirk. "Smart mouth," Silas said, but he was smiling too. Later, as the three of them sat on the porch, sharing a plate of cornbread and honey, Jessie turned to Silas. "You ever think about putting up a second sign?" "What would it say?" Jessie shrugged. "Just something that says we're still here, that we ain't going anywhere." Silas leaned back in his chair, watching the stars come out one by one. "I think we're writing that sign every day, son, word by word." And Jessie, now Jessie McCade by heart, if not yet by law, nodded like he understood. Because he did. Some names were carved in wood, but the ones that mattered, those were carved in time. The first frost came overnight. Jessie woke to find the ground glazed with a thin layer of white, the porch steps dusted in ice. He pulled on his coat, 2 sizes too big but warm as a hug, and stepped outside. The air smelled like wood smoke and earth, and his breath came out in clouds. Maisie sat bundled under a quilt on the porch swing, watching the chickens peck through the frost. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, a gap now visible in her front teeth. "Cold," she said. Jessie grinned. "Yeah, but not cold enough to stay inside." He poured feed into the trough, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. Over by the barn, Silas was already at work, hauling hay with slow, steady movements. Age hadn't taken his strength, but it made him take his time. "Morning," Jessie called. Silas nodded, setting the pitchfork aside. "Winter's coming fast. Think we'll get snow?" Silas glanced at the sky. "If the mountain gets white before the end of the week, you'll be sledding by Christmas." Jessie liked the sound of that. Christmas, a word that once meant cold nights and empty plates, now meant warm bread, music, and stories told by the fire. They had started a new tradition, not because they planned it, but because they needed it. Every Sunday, Clara came by with pie, and sometimes old Sam Duggan would bring a jug of cider. They'd sit out on the porch, play cards, and talk about things that didn't hurt. And then there were the stories. Maisie had taken to telling tall tales about talking horses and magical cows, and every time she spoke, Silas listened like she was reciting scripture. Jessie swore the old man hadn't smiled so much in 20 years. That afternoon, Silas called Jessie into the kitchen. On the table was a box, flat, wooden, and worn smooth at the corners. "What's that?" Jessie asked. Silas opened the lid and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, a small bottle of ink, and a pen. "You're old enough to decide something for yourself now," he said. Jessie tilted his head. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means if you want it, I can make the adoption official. We'd need to sign. You'd take the name legal, not just in paint over a barn door." Jessie stared at the paper, hands suddenly heavy. "I already feel like yours," he said. "I don't need a paper." "I know," Silas said. "But sometimes it's good to have something that can't be taken back." Jesse nodded slowly, then reached for the pen. His hand shook a little as he wrote, "Jesse Harper McCade." Silas watched the ink dry, then reached for the pen himself and signed beneath it. "There," he said. "Done." Jesse folded the paper back into the box and closed the lid. "I want to show Maisie," he said. "She'll be proud," Silas replied. That weekend, Clara arrived with cinnamon rolls and Sam Duggan brought over a guitar. They played music while the kids danced in the yard. Even Silas tapped his foot against the porch post. At one point, Maisie ran inside and came out holding the drawing she'd made weeks ago, the stick figures under a crooked tree. She had added a dog this time, and a house with smoke curling from the chimney. Jesse bent down beside her. "Who's that one?" She pointed to the new stick figure. "That's you, Pa." He blinked, caught off guard. "I thought that was Silas." She shook her head. "He's already on there." Jesse turned the page again and realized she had drawn two tall figures now, both with hats. One was Silas. The other was him. He looked up and met Silas's eyes across the yard. "She called me Pa." Silas nodded. "You earned it." Later, after the guests had gone and the kids were asleep, Silas sat on the porch, pipe in hand, watching the wind play with the shadows across the yard. Jesse joined him, draping a blanket over his shoulders. "You think we'll be okay?" Jesse asked. Silas took a long draw from the pipe. "We already are." "But what if someone else comes after the land? Or Maisie gets sick again? Or—" Silas held up a hand. "Worry don't change what's coming. It just ruins today." Jesse was quiet a long while. "You ever regret anything?" "Plenty," Silas said. "But not this." He reached into his coat and pulled out the small photograph of Everett Harper. "Your father. He saved me. Not just from dying, but from being the kind of man who dies alone. You coming off that train, that was him giving me a second chance." Jesse looked down. "I wish he could see us." Silas placed the photo between them on the porch rail. "He does." By the time the snow came, the ranch was ready. Jesse had stacked wood up to the rafters, Maisie had knitted lopsided scarves with Clara's help, and Silas had made a new sign for the barn. It read simply, "Still Standing." And they were. That night, snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, softening the edges of the world. The porch light glowed golden against the white. Inside, the fire crackled, and laughter filled the small home, real, rich, alive. Jesse stood by the window, watching Maisie twirl in her socks, and felt something settle in his chest. Not fear, not doubt, belonging. Silas walked up behind him, clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Merry Christmas, son." Jesse turned. "Merry Christmas, Pa." And in that warm little house, while the wind howled gently through the hills and the snow piled high, 3 souls sat down to supper, not as a broken past, but as a whole family. Exactly where they were meant to be,